Welcome to Top Talk. I'm Rusif Huseynov, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Professor Mark Galeotti, one of the most respected voices on Russian politics, security, and organized crime. Professor Galeotti, great to have you with us.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Professor Galeotti is the director of Mayak Intelligence and has held academic and research positions at some of the world's leading institutions. But I will stop here because we wouldn't have sufficient time to list all his credentials. Professor, I want to jump straight into our conversation and to start with this one. One thing that has puzzled me, and I'm sure many others, is why Vladimir Putin of Russia didn't take advantage of Donald Trump's push for peace deal on Ukraine a couple of months ago. The Trump administration appeared willing to broker an agreement at almost any cost, which could have played very well for Russia. Why didn't Putin capitalize on that moment, and does it still matter today?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. And I know as a sort of pundit, we're always meant to project absolute confidence and that we know exactly what's going on in Putin's mind and his inner circle. I will be honest, I was surprised too, because that was a dream deal, even greater, frankly, than I think the Russians could have expected. Now, admittedly, it was with America, not Ukraine, in the sense of this wouldn't necessarily have ended the war, but in terms of the damage it would have done to Ukraine, the damage it would have done to Western unity, and indeed the promise of a complete lifting of sanctions from the United States. These are all extraordinary deals. So why do I imagine Putin rejected this deal? I think the trouble is, I think has begun to become susceptible to the sort of the one more push fallacy that we've seen in so many wars, particularly in fact with the Russians in the First World War. That sense of we can get a deal now, but we're about to launch another offensive and then we'll get an even better deal. It's a deeply foolish assumption, but nonetheless, it's one that so many leaders have, especially leaders without military experience, which we must remember Putin is, often fall into. So I think he was overconfident in his capacity to continue to maintain Trump sort of on the hook. And also that his summer offensive was going to make more dramatic advances than it seems to be making, so that maybe he thought there was some kind of better deal. I will be honest, that is the only real explanation that just seems to make sense. Because otherwise, why would he have not taken that deal? And does it matter now? Well, I mean, I think it was a window of opportunity which I think pretty much has closed. I think Trump is both, to a degree, exasperated with Putin, although he seems to be willing to forgive a lot. But at the same time, Trump is now occupied with other matters. There's the Middle East. There's his big, beautiful bill at home. This is a man who has, even by the standards of leaders, a fairly limited bandwidth. And therefore, I think, in a way, Russia doesn't really matter. And even if we think of it in terms of his apparent sincere desperation to have a Nobel Peace Prize. We've already have him nominated for his sterling work in the Middle East. So I think for all of these reasons, Trump is less willing to put any kind of political capital behind a deal with Russia. And I think therefore, in a way, it matters because we know that the war will just grind on for the moment.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. If we continue this very topic a little bit, I remember when Trump raised his Ukraine proposal vis-a-vis Russia. There were some speculations, some talks, especially in our part of the world, the post-Soviet space, about possible Yalta-style grand bargain between the two superpowers in terms of like dividing the world into spheres of influence. Do you think this kind of geopolitical settlement, Yalta 2.0, is even conceivable as of now, or the chance is also missed for Russia? Or maybe the world is simply too multipolar and fragmented for that to work anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think that last point you made is the really important one. Um, Look, the irony is both Putin and Trump, on some levels, share a very similar worldview. Essentially, really a 19th century neo-colonial one, which is that the world is divided into a handful of countries that are the decision makers. And then the rest, the only real question is whose sphere of influence do they fall into? So on that level, then some concept of a sort of Yalta 2.0 would seem to almost make sense. However, the real issue is China. There is no way. I mean, Russia is, I won't necessarily say a declining power, but certainly a declined power. It is no longer the Soviet Union. Um, if you were going to have some kind of Yalta 2.0, considering that, atomic missile throw weight only goes so far in terms of assessing national power, who else would you have to have at that table? You'd have to have Brussels, you'd have to have India, and above all, you'd have to have China, as a sort of bare minimum. I cannot see Trump convening some grand bargain with these particular interlocutors. And it's not just racism, but there is that sort of sense of, again, I think Trump really sort of believes that somehow the United States and the Russian Federation could do this, but they absolutely couldn't.
I see. Professor, while preparing for this very interview, I tried to catch up with your recent conversations, and in one of them a couple of months ago, you mentioned that 2026 could be especially difficult, or I should put it, tougher for Russia. Could you expand on what you actually meant? What kind of pressure can the Kremlin face next year? Domestic, economic, or international? So, do you see converging on Russia next year?
Yes, I think that there is a case one can make that say that next year, or maybe very late this year, will be a point when a variety of simmering challenges all come to the boil. First of all, in terms of the economy, it was quite striking at the recent St. Petersburg International Economic Forum that Putin himself had to address the issue of a potential looming recession. Now, of course, he was and had to be bullish and say, no, 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 this won't happen and we cannot allow this to happen. But the very fact that he was even forced to discuss it was really quite telling. We have Maxim Reshetnikov, who's the Minister of Economic Development, actually warning about this quite openly, which again is very unusual for a Russian minister. Elvira Nabiullina, the chair of the Russian Central Bank, an exceedingly able financial operator, likewise, sort of warning of problems up ahead, and the degree to which there is an incompatibility. Continued high defense spending creates inflation. The only way of controlling that inflation is to keep interest rates high. High interest rates are strangling Russian business. Now, again, this does not mean that it's heading for some kind of crash or collapse or anything dramatic, but just certainly that the pressures which so long have been kept to bear are really coming to the fore. And that means that Putin's going to have to make tough decisions, which Putin tends to try to avoid. He's not, for all of his macho sort of public persona, he's not someone who likes making tough decisions. But up to now, he's tried to balance protecting the interest, the wealth of the population at large, and also fighting his war. It's going to get harder and harder to do both. So, clearly he will prioritize war over public well-being. But nonetheless, that will start to become more and more evident in terms of people's pay packets, in terms of the prices of food in the shops, but also in terms of public services. We're already seeing police 20%, 25% under strength, the health system facing severe pressures, that kind of thing. So that's kind of challenge one. The second one is a military one. Um, it may well get harder and harder to continue to acquire recruits. Remember, this is a war that for the Russians is being fought by volunteers in order to minimize the political impact. But also, in terms of the armored vehicles and the like, the Russians have been working through huge stockpiles of Soviet era kit, dating back in some cases to the late 1960s, modernizing them briefly, but then sending them to the front because they're only producing a fraction of what they lose in a year. They're losing over 1,000 tanks, for example, a year, 200 to 300 new tanks. So they very much have to depend on these stockpiles, and these stockpiles are beginning to run low. Increasingly, what's left is just simply, junk or can only be used for spare parts. Now, again, this doesn't mean that suddenly the Russian forces are going to collapse, and Ukraine itself is also under severe pressure. But nonetheless, it does mean that there's going to be a series of tough decisions that will be made on have to be made on the battlefield and on the domestic, political, and economic front that up to now Putin has been able to dodge.
Professor, um, you broke down in a very beautiful way the economic problems Russia may face in the coming months. For those of us living in the post-Soviet space, there's constant speculation about what kind of Russia might emerge from the war in Ukraine. Assuming there is eventually a ceasefire or peace deal, what does that mean for Russia's broader international posture, especially in the so-called near abroad? Can we see a more assertive or aggressive Russia or more constrained? What is your prediction?
I think, and look, this is obviously very much, cautious and careful prediction. Look, I think we have to think of in terms of long-term and short-term impact. In the longer term, it is possible that the Ukraine war, which, however it ends, is clearly, and obviously Putin's propagandists will claim that whatever happens is a grand triumph against all of NATO and so forth. But in practice, it is clear that what Putin anticipated when he went in February 2022, he will have failed to accomplish. Even if he now holds on to 20% of Ukrainian territory or whatever, that was never the point. So it is possible that this war will represent that moment, and it happens to all decaying empires. They are no longer the great power they once were. It was the Suez Crisis for Britain, it was the Algerian War for France. So it is possible that Russia will begin to realize that it is no longer this great power that can control all of Eurasia and the so-called near abroad, or that just simply it's not worth it. But that's the long-term possible impact. In the short term, again, we unfortunately may well be in a situation in which exactly a Kremlin that is aware that to a degree it failed in Ukraine, that the price of its war in Ukraine has been to lose a lot of authority elsewhere. I mean, I'm really struck, for example, by what's happening in Central Asia, where Russia's standing as a security guarantor has fallen dramatically, and particularly Kazakhstan. A month before the invasion, Putin manages to sort of, well, Russia leads an intervention into Kazakhstan, into the civil war come coup that had emerged, and backed the current leader against the previous one. And one would have thought that there will be a certain gratitude as a result. Instead, what do we have? But actually, he's becoming increasingly critical of Russia's position in Ukraine. He clearly no longer, he doesn't fear, he doesn't feel he needs Moscow. So I think in those circumstances, and just likewise, if one looks at the South Caucasus and the degree to which Armenia itself is now realizing that its reliance upon Russia has proven to be a massive strategic vulnerability rather than an asset, and in fact, the Armenians are increasingly critical of Moscow. I think that there may be that need to try and flex some muscle,
Yeah.
to try and show that in fact, hey, don't write us off. We're still a powerful force. So I think countries like Georgia, for example, may well have reasons to worry about the short-term future. But of course, final caveat, that presumes that Putin is in the Kremlin still.
Yeah.
If Putin is no longer in the Kremlin, then in a way all bets are off because it very much depends on what kind of regime emerges after him.
Yeah, Professor, I wanted to ask specifically about South Caucasus at the end of our interview, but it's good that you mentioned the January events in Kazakhstan in 2022, and I guess um, that was probably the peak of Russia's might back then because they had already deployed their troops in Karabakh. They had their military presence in Azerbaijan. Kazakhstan was next, and Ukraine also seemed an easy task for them. Uh, but if we continue this subtopic a little bit more, and if I may go provocative here, uh, could could Ukraine become Russia's Afghanistan at some point? Not necessarily in terms of defeat, but in terms of long-term societal and political consequences. demobilize the veterans, which shaped the landscape of the 1990s in the post-Soviet Russia. Public disillusionment, internal instability, and even disintegration. Is that a plausible scenario for you?
Sadly for Russia, yes, and in fact it could even be worse. I mean, as someone who actually did his doctorate on the impact of the Afghan war on the Soviet Union, the striking thing was the practical impact of the Afghan war on the Soviet Union was relatively limited. This was a pretty small war. You know, over the course of 10 years, a million Soviets cycled through that war, civilian and military. If one looks at Ukraine in 3.5 years, more than a million Russians out of a rather smaller population, 140 million compared with 280 million, have passed through the Ukrainian war. But if I kind of break down the impacts, I mean, in political terms, as I said, what was important about Afghanistan was that it took place at a time in which the Soviet Union was in decay. And in a way, Afghanistan became a useful political idiom, a way of talking about lots of other problems in a very dramatic way. So you talk about Afghanistan as a way of talking about how an out of touch political leadership makes stupid decisions that ordinary Russian or Soviets have to pay for. You use Afghanistan as a way of saying about why the medical system, the health service, fails to meet the needs of its people. You use Afghanistan to talk about the nationalities issue. I mean, when I traveled around, and this was in 1988 to 91, the thing that always struck me is wherever I was in the Soviet Union, everyone was convinced that their nationality was being unfairly singled out to be sent to Afghanistan to die in the battlefield. Now, as near as I could tell from the data, that actually was not the case. But the reality doesn't matter. It's how people think about it and use that to form political coalitions that matter. And I think, we may well see that kind of thing emerging in the Russian Federation, not in the sense of leading to a breakup of the Federation or anything like that, but a way of criticizing the regime, a way of saying why the regime has failed to meet its promises, its social contract. Secondly, you talk about the veterans. I mean, yes, this is an interesting issue. Um, at the moment, the veterans are really pinned in the war because they're volunteers and because most of them have signed contracts that basically keep them there for the duration of the special military operation. Some get to go on leave, but basically speaking, no one is being let go unless they are so badly wounded that absolutely they cannot fight. So at present, the social impact is limited, but the point is eventually the war will end, and eventually most of those soldiers will return home brutalized, unhappy, suddenly having to cope almost certainly with a massive diminution in their salaries, because they're being paid a lot of money while they're at the front. Um, a lot of them, frankly, well, I mean, again, if we look at past wars, 30 to 35% of them are going to have post-traumatic stress disorder in some form or another. A lot of illegal guns being held. There's 12 million estimated illegal guns circulating within the Russian Federation. So already, yes, we're going to see, organized crime recruiting them, or them forming their own organized crime groups. We're also just going to see an upsurge in violence and disaffection. We've already seen about 500 murders carried out by ex-soldiers coming home. So, I mean, in this circumstance, it is going to be massively disruptive. And again, it will undermine dramatically any attempt by the Kremlin to say, oh, this was a victory, really. Because people are going to say, wow, so we get to spend on rebuilding Mariupol, but my son, my brother, my husband, or whatever is now a broken man, unhappy, angry. And finally, and I'm going on about this, but again, it's a sort of subject that I've looked at quite a bit, so excuse me.
No, please.
There is a political impact. I mean, who captures these veterans politically? One thing that the Soviet Union did quite effectively was to elevate figures who were both kind of establishment figures, generals and colonels and the like, but also could be considered to be credible heroes of the Soviet Union, heroes of the war. And in the future, then they would go on often to become political problems for the Kremlin. Had figures like Alexander Rutskoy, vice president, who actually backed rebels against Boris Yeltsin in the 1993 constitutional crisis. But nonetheless, they represented bridges between the Kremlin and the veterans. They could advance the veterans' cause to the Kremlin, and they could represent the Kremlin to try and sort of harness the veterans. Putin hasn't dared allow any uh, senior military officers to become heroes.
Mhm.
So, because he doesn't want to have any political problems, he essentially is storing up future political problems because he won't really have anyone who can reach out with authority to the veterans. And this means that we have no idea where politically these angry ex-soldiers will go. And increasingly, what we see is the rise of the so-called angry patriots, people who are nationalists, they're not liberals in any way. Their problem is with the Kremlin for basically fighting the war so badly rather than invading Ukraine in the first place.
Mhm.
And so, these people might just all go home and disillusioned and disaffected. They might conceivably be captured by one of the existing political parties, though frankly, they're all pretty much kind of clones and creatures of the Kremlin. They might get captured by liberal forces. It's possible. We've seen it in some other sort of wars. Or they might get captured by ultra-nationalists. Again, it's a real wild card issue at the moment.
Professor, you drew parallels with the Afghanistan war and your experience, and you referred to the resentment and complaints from different ethnic non-Russian groups after the war. Um and nowadays from media we also learn that there are tens of thousands of non-Russians. Uh, like I do not refer to the North Koreans in this case, but different ethnic groups within the Russian Federation who go to Ukraine en masse, especially from the Far East. But can we also like draw parallels in this particular case and see that there's sometime in the future inter-ethnic relations and societal harmony can also be disrupted?
I mean, it is possible, but there is one very big difference that in Afghanistan, the soldiers were conscripts.
Yeah.
So they had no choice. And there, again, there was, so it's easier to think of it, oh, those damn Russians in the Kremlin did this to us. In this case, these are people, are volunteers.
Mhm.
And again, public opinion can change in the future, but at the moment, there almost seems to be the sense that, well, they're basically playing the lottery, a very bloody lottery. If they win and they come out of this okay, then they will have made a lot of money. If they die, well, their families still get very generous death benefits. And ironically, it has led to shallow but actually quite real economic development in a lot of impoverished regions in the North Caucasus and in the Far East in particular, precisely because the places where more people are impoverished, there are going to be more volunteers for the war. And when they die, the money comes home and is reinvested in sprucing up the apartment and building a dacha and buying a new car and whatever else. So the perverse fact of the matter is that this is something that has enriched impoverished areas to a degree. But of course, yes, in what we may find, I don't think is necessarily interethnic tensions. It is more that sense of the wealthy, predominantly but not exclusively Russians, the Moscow, the St. Petersburg, and the other major cities people who didn't go and volunteer in the fight, and we blue collar, working class type figures. So actually, I mean, it's more likely to be a class, I would suggest, than a national resentment that emerges, particularly once the war ends. Exactly, as I say, people will come back and suddenly find that, you know, their income falls dramatically, and they're now working in a factory or working behind a till at the local supermarket. And that's when they're going to feel as if they've just been thrown out once they're no longer useful.
I see. Last but not least, South Caucasus, a region which is still part of the Russian near abroad. What does this region mean for Russia today, and how has Russia's position in the South Caucasus evolved, particularly in the aftermath of the 2020 Karabakh War and amid the ongoing conflict in Ukraine?
I mean, I think, frankly, South Caucasus represents a clear example of Russian foreign policy failure, because what we saw was essentially that as Azerbaijan built up its authority, its power, and its military force, as it built a closer and closer alliance with Turkey, which, after all, is a significant player in the regional politics. Essentially, Russia was faced again with tough decisions. And as I say, Putin tends not to like to have to take tough decisions. Was he going to think, well, okay, in some ways, Azerbaijan is no longer sort of ours, but an autonomous actor with a close connection with Turkey. And therefore, we need to double down on controlling Armenia. And that also means supporting Armenia, even to the extent of having to challenge this Turkish Azeri sort of alliance, or not? And the answer was they chose not to. They didn't want to be bothered to put the resources into it. And the result was precisely the outcome of the 2020 war. And in a way, Russia lost, I would suggest, almost all credibility in the region at that stage. Doesn't mean to say it couldn't have recovered it, but again, that would have taken effort, that would have taken resources. And there was no one really in Putin's circle to speak up for the importance of the South Caucasus. So I think this is very much an example of the kind of implicit decolonization, de-imperialization of the near abroad. That the old instincts, the old assumptions that somehow you don't mess with Moscow and Moscow's interests. Now people are increasingly saying, well, why not? And that actually Moscow's tools are rather more limited than was assumed. So it's hard, frankly, not to see that the South Caucasus is lost to Russia. It may in the future seek to influence it, absolutely. I mean, and we're seeing with this current quite extraordinarily sort of rapid explosion in tensions between Baku and Moscow. Um, you know, there are still going to be connections. There are pipelines, there are economic connections, there are interpenetrations of ethnic groups and all sorts of financial connectivities. So, Russia, but now Russia is just one more player
Yeah.
in an area in which Turkey, indeed Iran, and maybe less so at the moment, but historically, Iran had become increasingly interested. I mean, I mentioned it's been a long time since I was in Baku, and the thing that struck me about Baku was precisely that you walk down a street, and in a 5-minute walk, you will pass. Russians, but also Americans and Brits and Israelis and Iranians. It had a more of a Casablanca feel in that respect than anything else. Again, in this context, the Russians are now no longer the in the sort of assumed great power. They're just another player.
Yeah. Dear friends, it was Mark Galeotti. Professor Galeotti, thank you very much for this super interesting conversation. I
And my
appreciate it.
great pleasure.